Hello, music historians. Welcome to my presentation for Seminar in Music History. Today we are going to be talking about French composer Erik Satie, who I have titled an iconoclast. We'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, but for this presentation, we'll generally be looking at is the life of Erik Satie, his personality, a specific work of his, and then research that has been conducted on that work. So, with that said, let's just get right into it. Before we begin, now most people would start with a biography in a presentation like this anyway. I will be starting with biography, but I think it's particularly important that in talking about Satie, his biography is discussed first. Satie was an extremely particular person whose writing style, whose really compositional mind revolved around all these life events that happened to him. So even more so than other composers, I think it's especially important to take careful note of what's going on in Satie's life when his music's written. It sounds like Beethoven in a way, where it's very sectionalized into different parts, which we'll get into in just a bit on how I specifically sectionalize Satie's life. But with that said, who is Satie? Satie was born in Honfleur, France, to a modest family. Not rich, but not poor. Exactly fine. But his father thought, you know what? A lot of people are moving to Paris and making these big, flashy new lives for themselves. Maybe I could move to Paris as well and start a business there and help my family be a little better off. So that's just what he did at the very young age of about 4 years old for our young Satie that we'll be talking about. His father moved his whole family over to Paris. Unfortunately, it did not last long, for very early on, Satie's mother passed away. His father, trying to start a successful business from not a whole lot in a new city, sent young Erik Satie and his brother Conrad home to live with their grandparents so that he could focus on kickstarting his business. That'll be significant in a little bit, but for the time being, Satie's father stays in Paris. Satie and his brother move back to Honfleur where they were born to be with their grandparents. And it's here that we have what I call the first inspiration with stars. Now, if you study Satie in any sort of professional vein, this is not a term you're going to see these inspirations. But I've chosen to use these stars in the word inspiration with numerical characters before them to subdivide Satie's life into events that really caused, clicks that would go on to influence him for better, for worse, but what they had in common was that they would influence him. So this first significant influence is Satie, while in Honfleur, started organ lessons with the local organist. Anyone who's played organ or studied organ or listened to organ or knows some stuff about music history will know that you're not going to be playing a lot of romantic or modern music on the organ. It's going to be mostly Renaissance or Baroque music. Satie was also exposed to some Gregorian chant here as well, as we can see. But that's going to be a big inspiration for Satie's preferences and his style, not just because he started playing an instrument, he was introduced to musical vocabulary. But for those of you music historians who are particularly astute, you may know what's coming up in France soon with nationalism, neoclassicalism, denying of romanticism. So this could be kind of like a sparkling, flashy light of what is to come, perhaps. And this will again be a very big inspiration for Satie's tastes. So, even that unfortunately didn't last long, because a few years into these organ lessons, Satie's grandmother mysteriously drowned. And yeah, it's just that mysterious. No one really knows if it was an accident, if it was malicious, even just anything else other than that she drowned. It was very just weird. Fortunately, that meant that his Satie's grandfather was a little worried on whether or not he could, properly look after Satie and his brother Conrad. But his father comes in and said, "Hey, I've got this business started. I'm ready for my kids to come back." And so back to Paris they went. And not long after their return, Satie's father remarried, and Satie had a new stepmother. Perhaps a bit earlier than you may have expected, this will spark the second inspiration. There's our friend the star. However, this inspiration is a little more negative than the last one, and that is that Satie did not like his stepmother. And his stepmother was a piano teacher and amateur composer, sees this new son she has who started organ lessons and is showing some musical promise, and decides, you know what, I'm going to make this boy into my musical image. Um, she thought a little bit higher than herself than perhaps she should have, considering we don't really hear about her in music history. Just not saying anything, but Satie did not agree with this whatsoever. He was very uncooperative. He wanted nothing to do with it, and as we will find out, Satie will be a very stubborn person, both from this early point in his life to his last dying moments. Satie is going to be one of the most stubborn people you will read about in music history. So, after putting his new stepmother, through the ringer for about a year, she sent him to the Paris Conservatory to an early preparatory piano program. You may have heard of the Paris Conservatory, quite a significant venue. A lot of significant composers, both from France and outside of France, studied there. So how's Satie going to do there? Well, as you may have just noticed, Satie's mother was making him go there, his stepmother, and Satie wanted nothing to do with his stepmother. So he, being stubborn, did not do very well. He was widely considered by his peers and the faculty there to be gifted, but lazy and poor at sight reading. And I have to give him credit for this, because if you read about someone like Mozart, who was a prodigy out the gate and was putting on full concerts of this amazingly difficult music at 4 years old, it can be a little daunting. But Satie, I can relate. It's struggling with sight reading, not really having inspiration, being apathetic for some of your studies, even if it's something you enjoy. Music. Satie didn't necessarily hate music, but he's very apathetic and very angry at his stepmother. It's a very relatable stance for a composer, and one particular faculty there even called Satie the single laziest student at the entire conservatory, which is a pretty big statement, especially from a place like this, I can only imagine. However, there was one thing that Satie was even more stubborn about that he didn't want to do, other than sitting at the conservatory for his mother, and that was military service. See, in France at the time, and not unlike some other places in the world today, when you became an adult, you had to do 4 years of mandatory military service. However, if you were a student at the Paris Conservatory, that got reduced to 1 year. So, a friend of Satie remarked that this is probably the only reason he was even still in the conservatory at this point. However, Satie, even that 1 year was too much. And to kind of make an example of just how stubborn this kid was, at a time when medical advancements were not as widespread as they were today, where people did not know as much about medicine as we did today, Satie purposely went and contracted bronchitis to get out of a single year of military service. Bronchitis isn't exactly a fun thing to have by today's standards, but going and purposely contracting it, that's a statement. So, yeah, and he's gonna keep being stubborn all the way to the end. However, one positive thing that did come out of the conservatory, at the least, was that Satie began his compositional career, which is something he found he enjoyed at least a bit, even though he generally did not enjoy being at the conservatory for his stepmother. The music he wrote would be bought by his father's publishing firm. Hey, remember, his father was starting a business. It just so happened to be a publishing firm that could publish music, and so he would buy his son's music. But despite this, Satie's familial relationships were not fantastic. Again, he did not like his stepmother. His father would obviously take his stepmother's side, And Satie wasn't exactly thrilled that his father sent him away so that he could stay in Paris and make money all those years ago. And I'm sure that Satie's mother died. He was around 4 years old, I believe, so he's probably old enough to have retained memories of his previous mother. All in all, not a great relationship between them. And finally, early 20s, he said, "You know what? I'm done. I'm moving away, and I'm going to make my own life, not too unlike how young adults do today, moving out of their parents' house." And so that's what he did. And here we have another star as we come on the next inspiration of the young Satie. So, where Satie moved, there was a cabaret very close. What's a cabaret? Well, it's kind of like a cafe or nightclub with live entertainment, where at the time in France, a lot of artistic minded people were gathering and discussing various topics, from poets to artists to musicians to actors, all kinds of things. And Satie would become a very regular attendant at this cabaret and would just absorb all these quirky personalities of the people there. And on top of wanting to separate himself from his parents, he had a pretty significant lifestyle change. Uh, so he changed the spelling of his name from Eric with a C to Eric with a K. He self-declared himself the title of gymnopedist, uh, unironically, pardon my French, um, which was a title based off some pieces he was writing, which I have a link to right here. We're going to give those a listen in just a sec. But before that, um, how did his personality change? So he started living a kind of bohemian lifestyle. He grew his hair out really long. He'd wear these really big, long coats and uh, significant, like big hats. Um, and the more and more he interacted with people, and in fact, this is down here, he'd eventually, a couple years in, he was such a recognized person there, he'd get his foot in the door to become the conductor of the cabaret using some of that music knowledge he had. And as soon as he became the conductor, he'd start interacting with these people more and more, and his personality would just become more and more extreme, and his sense of humor would become more and more defined. So, with that said, let's take a listen to these pieces he defined himself on. Will also be a very good opportunity for us to get an idea of what he was writing.
I didn't order a pizza.
I know. But that Parker promo saved me so much in my insurance.
And
brought you a little something special.
How people may react to that. So, with that said, there's three of these. We're going to listen to parts of 1 and 3. And there's something I really like about this specific performance that I'll mention in a bit. So, go ahead and take a listen. So you can get kind of an idea of how the first of these pieces goes. So let's fast forward to the third one, and it will perhaps become apparent to you what I love about these pieces so much. So I'm just going to pick a random spot and go like there. Take a listen. Okay, so what I love about this specific recording, and that you may have noticed yourself, is that the performer switches outfits in between performances, but it sounds like it could be the same piece that later on, even like the spot I fast forward to, even it started with the exact same bass pattern, same bass notes. I mean, that bass pattern continues through the whole piece, but like even like even the notes are the same, other than the accompaniment with the right hand. So it's just like I don't know. It's very speaking to how, at least what I find is funny, and perhaps speaking to Satie's more humorous, eclectic nature. But this video also provides us with a little insight as to how this, not even just in this piece, but Satie's compositional style was very non-romantic, very unassuming, very non-in-your-face. It's really just kind of chilling its own thing, which I enjoy, but obviously, as we'll see, not everyone might take that super seriously or consider him to be a very advanced composer, because obviously there's not a whole lot there. It's not particularly difficult. It's just, in a way, what it needs to be, and not much else. So, continuing onward. So, Trouble at the Cabaret. As we are going to find, Satie was a quite argumentative person, and when he got in an argument with somebody, he would hold that grudge pretty much forever, honestly. Just that's the gist of it. He would get in a quarrel here with some of the cabaret workers, and he would say, you know what, I'm done with this job, even though he enjoyed, the venue. That argument was enough for him to say, I'm out. And so he left for a piano performance career. Wouldn't go too great, but something important that came out of it is I have a little star here, not quite an influence, but something important nonetheless. He had his first meeting with Debussy. Debussy would look at his works and see a mature depth in them that, again, we just listened to one of his early works. Not a lot of people saw it as having depth, but Debussy was like, you know what, this guy's pretty all right. I like what he's writing. So this would trigger a lifelong friendship between Debussy and Satie. It'd be one of Satie's longest lasting friendships. It's impressive because they would actually get in some squabbles due to Satie's turbulent nature. But despite that, they were able to remain friends, which again, for Satie's stubbornness over his life, was quite impressive. Unfortunately, despite this positive meeting with Debussy, his piano performance degree wasn't going well. He was having some financial troubles, ignoring the fact that he had just quit his job, was recently moved out of his parents' house, and he was a working musician in the early 20th, late 19th centuries. He wasn't having a great time. So how did Satie deal with this? Well, he quite literally ran away from his problems. He just left and hoped that his creditors and people he owed money wouldn't find him. And thus he relocated. Perhaps not the most elegant of options, but sometimes running away from your problems literally does pay off, as we'll see for Satie, because his relocation would accidentally almost land him a new job with this Order of the Rose Croix, which was based on the Catholic Church. You can see it's a cultist, even considered. Based on the Catholic religion, it was kind of mystic, so not really officially recognized by the church. It was run at the time in this location that Satie happened upon by a Josephine Pelledin. And what this sect was all about is they wanted something new. And so they heavily encouraged and offered Satie the opportunity to experiment with his compositions. And not only did it give him the freedom to experiment and try with all these different new ideas, but it gave him an audience to listen, which is very important. And so Satie came up with a lot of ideas during this period, including his incidental music. What's incidental music? It's music that essentially exists to not be listened to, or to exist as background noise. think of it as the precursor to elevator music. It would be music that played either while people were doing something else, like talking, or music that played in between, uh, performances of a certain event, like you could say movements or scenes in a theater. If there was ever intermission time, some incidental music would be playing, and I mean, most people at this point had written music uh, to be listened to. Obviously, it's kind of strange that this late in history it really started really gained a name and started getting attention. But hey, Satie helped spearhead it, so there's that. However, once again, he'd get in an argument, this time with Peladon, and he would leave his position. Satie. And unfortunately, he'd kind of enter a downward spiral from there in the search for identity. His experimentation was exhausted. He was doing it for a couple of years at this point. After his fight, he was just out of ideas. He couldn't come up with anything, and he was freaking out because he felt like in all this experimenting after it, and when he had run out of ideas, he felt like he still didn't really have a personal style in his composition, which, like, so many people, especially in France at the time, composers were, whether they be impressionists like Debussy or even some of the romantics, putting their expression into their compositional style. He just felt like he didn't have anything that was his own, and that was really discouraging to him. He started becoming increasingly paranoid. Speaking of paranoid, he started having other signs of mental trouble. At this time was when he entered his only, at least the only that we know of, romantic relationship with his neighbor. It's nothing particularly to write home about, but it did not go over well. And it was just another thing, You ever just have another thing where it's like you already have a million things to worry about, and then one other kind of small things happens that on its own wouldn't be that big of a deal, but with everything else, it's just like, this relationship was one of those things for him. It was just another thing weighing on his mind. On top of that, he had just quit his job, so he obviously didn't have money, and he didn't have a lot of money to begin with. He was in financial trouble and religious. So you may remember that his argument was with a certain Joseph and Peladon, who was the high priest of a cult. So Satie decided, you know what? I'll start my own order based on the Catholic Church, and that's just what he did. Satie started his own order, kind of half officially recognized, although still considered mystic. So kind of, the church is like, hey, we don't associate with that guy. But Satie started this order, of which he was the only member. And his first move as the high priest of this order was to excommunicate everyone he didn't like, starting with Peladon and then other people he quarreled with. So, off to a great start. He then used the kind of official nature of his organization to get articles published in newspapers, making scathing attacks towards his critics and towards people he didn't like. Not exactly the sign of a super healthy person, mentally anyway. Very argumentative, very defensive, and very insecure. But that happened, so you do you, Satie. Anyway, he decided to relocate again, this time to suburbs outside Paris, kind of making his way back, specifically about 10 miles outside Paris. And here his appearance and identity would change again, this time for the last time in his life. He was very particular, and yet he bought about 7 copies of the same outfit that he'd always wear, rain or shine. And speaking of rain or shine, he carried with him an umbrella that he tied a hammer to on the bottom to bash people with in case they wanted to steal his music or his ideas or for any other reason. More signs of paranoia. However, if that wasn't mentally troubling enough, he only ever had this umbrella out during sunny weather. During rainy weather, which he loved, he'd put his umbrella away and put it in one of his coats, of which he had 7 of the same one. And he would just enjoy the rain. So, yeah, Erik Satie. His new lifestyle revolved around the 10-mile walk into Paris. He'd walk into Paris every day, where he'd work as a theater songwriter slash accompanist, where he didn't have a lot of freedom, certainly nowhere near as much as he had previously working for the Order of the Rose Croix. Um, and how his day would typically go is he'd make his walk into Paris. 10-mile walk is, probably going to take a decent amount of time. And he'd stop at these cafes on the way and he'd drink and he would compose. And then he'd leave and make his way to the next one and he'd drink and compose. And he'd do that all the way until he got to Paris and then he'd come home. And that's basically how his days would go. He wasn't necessarily officially an alcoholic because of this, but you may have noticed that's a lot of drinking, stopping at a lot of places along the way, which isn't great for your health. And that's going to become a factor in things later on down the road. So here's kind of really where it starts, his more heavy drinking. So here's our friend the star again. Another inspiration for our friend Satie. In his search for a style, he recognized that his technique was not great. He never wanted to pay attention in school, and he thought maybe the reason why I'm not doing as great as I want to, or maybe the reason why I don't have my own compositional style is because my technique's not great. So he decided to go back to school, this time of his own volition, and as such, because he was going to school for himself, his performance was much better. He wasn't a lazy student anymore because he had his own drive, which, again, I find pretty relatable. It's here he started composing a lot more satire. It was already there to begin with, but he really started embracing that humor side as he studied composition. And he ended with a degree in counterpoint, which not everyone can write in counterpoint. It's a very, not just obscure writing style, but it's quite intricate. So clearly he had the mind for it. And again, it kind of reflects back to his love of Baroque music, Renaissance music, lots of counterpoint back then. Not that it didn't exist afterwards, but it's the works of Bach, which I'm sure he played lots of on the organ, is going to have a lot of counterpoint. But despite this degree in counterpoint, Satie was a completely, exactly fine student, completely average, that accomplished nothing significant, got his degree with no problems, and that was about it. A completely average student. Again, a very relatable historical figure. Shoot, I feel that. So good for Satie. He got his degree this time though, so yeah, really good for him. It was around this time he'd had his biggest, perhaps not inspiration, it wasn't inspiration, but here's where his career started really taking off. So Ravel started becoming popular in France, and he was writing in an impressionistic style. And the harmonic aspect of impressionistic, people saw and was like, hey, remember that Satie guy? He wrote kind of like this. And they're like, hey, yeah, you're right. Harmonic impressionism linked back to Satie. All of a sudden, he becomes super popular because Ravel is seen as what? French in a time where nationalism was important. Satie becomes popular, and he gets a bunch of commissions, which means he finally starts to get some financial stability. He worked at other theaters, but this time he had way more compositional freedom. And a lot of his commissions were for humorous works. People started associating him with his sense of humor. People liked his sense of humor. People wanted more of it. So he started getting commissioned for what he wanted to do. And he enjoyed it. He worked in these theaters until his death. He died of liver failure and pleurisy in the lungs. Likely, in fact, not even likely, just due to all that heavy drinking from before. Which, he still lived for a good 60-ish years, which, considering he's not too far off the backs of romantic composers who were dropping like flies, is still pretty respectable, but ultimately it's unfortunate he had to die in such a not pleasant way. At his deathbed were some composers who said, hey, Satie, there's some people from figures from your life who want to come see you, come wish you well, people that you quarreled with, and Satie wanted nothing to do with them. All the people who came to his deathbed to try to reconcile with him, he refused. He was absolutely adamant in his grudges to the bitter end, and he died not having reconciled with them. He chose not to. He would not admit them see him. He wanted nothing to do with them, despite the fact that some people were like, hey, these people really want to make up with you before you die. But Satie, stubborn to the end. And he would have had it no other way, I suppose. So that's about the gist of Satie's life. So let's talk a little bit about a little bit more anyway on how he presented himself and defined some things. So I remember at the beginning of the paper, he talked about, or well, it was implied that Satie was an iconoclast. What is an iconoclast? It's someone who rejects a generally accepted collection of beliefs, wants to do things their own way, and that's what avant-garde is. Avant-garde, uh, especially particularly for this case in music, is denying the basic traditions. You want to try to do it in a different way that is not based off of the history or preset notion of beliefs and how music should work. For this case specifically, it's avant-garde and other areas of art, but for our purposes, that's the definition. So as we talked about, Satie had a lot of personas throughout his career, like 3 or 4 completely different ways of identifying himself throughout his life, which is just kind of crazy because, I mean, people generally change, but these were like completely different people, almost different personalities, definitely different versions of the eclectic attire. He never really dressed normally. 7 copies of the same outfit, or had a really long hair and wore huge coats. Just, he's all over the place. He had a very abrasive sense of humor, which we're going to examine a little bit more in the piece that we're going to study coming up. But it would come in his writing, and it was not uncommon for this to cause some quarrels, of which he would then be extremely stubborn. So these next 2 things are not, these last 2 bullet points aren't necessarily important, but they're just tidbits that I find a little bit interesting, and I thought you might also find interesting. So after Satie died, people went to his house, this little dingy shack outside Paris, to kind of assess things, see what the state of it was, and it was trash. There was clutter everywhere, loose papers just covering the entire floor, and it was clearly not something that happened overnight. It was clearly built up from a while, so it's not official that he was a hoarder, but some people interpret his house being obviously not upkept and just older things not really being disposed of as kind of a potential hoarding nature, considering Satie was not exactly mentally stable in a lot of aspects. It wouldn't be surprising. It's not confirmed, but just something you know. In the political world, again, not super important, but interesting, Satie was a pretty avid communist, and would use that religious cult he made earlier, of which he was the only member. Remember to post articles, like pro-communism articles at papers and such, and publish thoughts. So there's that. Not necessarily important to his composition, but it happened. Thought you should know what happened. So with that said, who did Satie influence? How did he influence them? Well, he really helped pioneer French nationalism. Again, that impressionism that Ravel used would be linked back to him, and he'd be accredited with a lot of it. Les Six, uh, well-known name in the French compositional world, considered Satie something of a patron saint. Satie of all people. So there's the influence there as well. John Cage would be an avant-garde composer later down the road. You may or may not have heard his name, uh, but he would love Satie, and we're going to talk about that in just a couple minutes. A little bit more on how John Cage interacted with some of Satie's work. But John Cage really loved Satie, and he became an inspiration for him. He even wrote letters to John Cage wrote letters to the deceased Satie and had a conversation with him, and he published, or maybe he didn't publish the letters, but they were published later on, and it's very interesting to read, to say the least. However, Satie also influenced art beyond music. He was a firm proponent of the term "no truth in art," and this statement would be kind of picked up by people in other art fields, whether it be painters or poets. And he associated with a lot of those people, again, from his time with cabarets and such, from composers like Debussy to even people like Picasso he met and worked with from time to time. So, um, quite widely known in the French area, especially later on in his life. Now, before we move on to the piece, I want to talk a little bit about his compositional methodology. So as we talked about, he pioneered avant-garde. I want nothing to do with the established beliefs. I want to do things my own way. This is a break from Romanticism, obviously, which is very self-expressionistic in the form of the way things used to be done. So then again, Satie has beginnings with the Baroque style, so it's not necessarily surprising. He increased expectation for the listener. Satie's humor was very specific, and sometimes he would put little inside jokes there that the uninformed listener might have no idea what's going on. And if they didn't understand the inside joke, they might not be able to appreciate it as much. Satie wrote messages to the performer in his music, usually that were sarcastic. Sometimes that maybe weren't sarcastic. It's hard to tell sometimes, but they were usually super random, just comments. One of which we're going to see an example of in the piece we're looking at today. But they were usually instructions on how to perform the piece, like, hey, slow down a ton here, or maybe something even as straight as good job, kind of thing. Things that Satie's music kind of foreshadow include impressionist harmonic progression. Debussy was playing with this a lot, but Satie also played with it a lot. Music that's kind of just in the moment. It's not trying to go anywhere tonally. It's not necessarily atonal, but it's not, working its way towards a 5/1 at the end. Is basically what that alludes to. This comes with total chromaticism. There were times where he used all 12 pitches in a piece without necessarily trying to make it sound good or have it go somewhere. Use the pitches just for the sake of the pitches. Also, minimalism. Minimalism is trying to write something with the least amount of required material, and that's it. Nothing more than it needs to be. And we're going to see an example of that as well. So now that we know all this about Satie, it's finally time to talk about the Vexations, the piece I have chosen to look at for this presentation and some experiments done on it, which is very fascinating. So let's look at a brief history of the Vexations first. The Vexations was not published during Satie's lifetime. It was found afterwards, probably when they were checking out all that clutter in his house after he passed away. It doesn't have a day of writing on it, but it's estimated to have been written in the 1890s, around the time he was a paladin and the crazy cult stuff, somewhere in his experimental phase. That's first popularized by John Cage, who found it, fell in love with it, and hosted a public hearing of it. Why is this? Well, remember those instructions that Satie wrote to the performer that was not meant for the audience to see. Satie indicated in this piece that the performer should play the piece in its entirety 840 times. Very random and a lot of times. So what John Cage did was basically host this huge performance that lasted hours and hours and hours and hours, almost like, I think, over 15 hours for this specific performance, where he had a bunch of different pianists come in and they take kind of shifts. And the whole concert was open to the public. Anyone could walk in and listen at any time. Okay? Well, obviously, people would come and go as the day and the performance went on. But, interesting tidbit, there was one person who stayed for the entirety of the performance. When you hear the performance, I'm not sure if you would agree that you would want to stay for this entire performance. But good for that guy, I guess. He could say he did it, and I respect him in a very strange way for doing that. Anyway, I have this sentence here, what is a motif? It's going to be relevant in just a sec as we look at the piece. So first, I'm not going to use this third link, I've decided, but let's look at the second link first. This is kind of an original kind of skin of the writing of the piece. It's kind of hard to determine. And now the second link is a piece that's an addition I'm not a huge fan of, but it has a pretty reliable translation. Everything that we need is here. So you can see, here's one of those notes from the author that we were talking about, and it says, to play this motive 840 times in succession, it will be right to prepare oneself previously, and in the most dead silence by earnest immobilities. Okay, so that's the message Satie said. Whether or not it was sarcasm, it's hard to tell, but people have obviously taken it seriously, because as we've come, people have performed this piece in its entirety of 840 times. Now, you may remember what I said, what is the motive? So here he says, in order to play this motive 840 times in succession, but this piece is kind of broken up into two sections. There's the baseline theme, which is just this single line down here, and then there's this harmonic section. And people have interpreted which of these is the motive differently. Some people have interpreted the motive as just being the theme. Some people interpret the motive as being the entire piece. It's not clear cut. Because of that, performance length of the 840 times can vary quite drastically. So, with that said, let's talk about a little bit more about the piece in detail, and then we'll give it a listen. So no instrument was actually indicated. The chordal part suggests a harmonic instrument, but again, the main theme is just a single line. A lot of instruments could play that. Bass clef line, of course, but still, it opens up a lot of possibilities. It's typically about a minute performance. People play it at different tempos. Usually it's played pretty slowly, but it's usually about 1 minute per performance. It shows a lot of those things we were talking about. There's present chromaticism, as we'll look at, because there's this video that we have of it will have the score, in case you didn't notice it before. The chordal structure is very impressionistic. It's not going anywhere. It's not trying to be a 5-1. It's not trying to be a 4-1. It's not trying to be any sort of something going to a 1. It's just existing for itself. And that bass line really reflects early minimalism. It's just a single line on a piece that's typically played on the piano. So let's give this a listen, shall we?
Flagstar Bank is doing everything we can to keep you connected to your money. You can access your checking account 24.
And it starts out at the theme down there. So here they went back to the theme before, which I believe is what these little indications are for. Kind of jumps to the theme. I think that's what this translated is, these kind of mini coda things. So here's the second half. One thing to notice while I finish this up is that a lot of these active down are very strangely used. Notice there's no key signature, but he still insists on using a lot of double flats and such. It's kind of curious to me, at least. But that's then the theme repeats again. So that's the gist of it. This one was just under 2 minutes, this person's performance. So very simple, pretty minimalistic. You can see it's not trying to go to a tonal center. Lots of interesting harmonics. Very based on individual lines for sure. So with that knowledge, let's talk about research, because some people have wanted to research this piece, and particularly for this presentation, I have looked at studies that were published on the same performer at the same time, that were published both by the Journal of New Music Research and the scholarly journal, The Psychology of Music. So these experiments, and specifically the ones we're looking at today, are based on the musician playing the piece on a piano, which is what the video will listen to play it on as well. Because again, no indicated instrument, for the full 840 times. They want to examine people playing it 840 times and examine over long periods of time how musicians, specifically in this case pianists, how over long periods of time they change their tempo, their dynamics, what their consciousness looks like, what their motor skills look like over a long period of time. For this particular experiment, there was a light emitting metronome that was active for the entire performance, which you just listen to the performance. Between the kind of dreamy, uncomfortable harmonic sound of it, having a metronome on top of that for as long as this performance took would drive me crazy. especially because the performance took almost 29 hours. You imagine listening to a metronome for 29 hours. It's just slightly in your ear while playing this strange, dreamy Satie. I can only imagine. And so let's take a look at this experiment. So the main goal of the performer going into this was to maintain a consistent, extremely slow tempo, as indicated. The performance was actually consistent for the first 14 hours. To me, seems like a really long time. I mean, even playing a recital for an hour feels like an eternity for some people. Even playing a recital for a half an hour can feel like an eternity. Or even playing a specific piece that's under 10 minutes in the heat of the performance can feel like an eternity. Obviously, this wasn't a professional situation. This is a professional performer as well. I should mention 14 hours, but they kept it consistent for 14 hours. That's crazy to me. Starting at about hour 15 is where the fluctuations really come in. The tempo first, then followed by dynamic control. So the tempo started to speed up. The performer probably was 14 hours in and realized they were only about 400 times into playing this piece. So had about 400 to go and wanted to get through it. So despite the metronome playing, they started speeding up against the metronome, followed by lack of dynamic control. The performance became much more careless, much more unmusical, much more uneven. It's just like less professional, I guess you could say. Around halfway through hour 13, there were also mistakes, intermittent from that point on. Despite the fact that performance on 29 hours, there actually weren't that many mistakes, which I find fairly impressive. I mean, this was a professional performer. It's not exactly a super difficult piece, but the performance continued. It never stopped, and it was uninterrupted. So, despite the mistakes, so I think that's fairly admirable over 29 hours. And ultimately, what the research found in this experiment was that over time, playing the piano kept your mind stimulated. Even though the pianist got extremely drowsy, their mind didn't check out, their consciousness didn't check out, their motor skills didn't check out, and the brain work of playing the piano over even over that long period of time, even though they were exhausted, it kept them engaged, which is very interesting to me at least. Obviously, this is an experiment conducted on a single person, so you can't necessarily say it's absolute, but again, there's not a lot of people that are probably willing to play Satie for 29 hours. I don't know if I'd be willing to do it for 29 hours. I have no idea whether this person ate or drank in those 29 hours. I don't think they were able to, so obviously they couldn't sleep. This was conducted in 2003. It was consensual, but that's still crazy to me, and I give the performer a lot of credit for doing it, and I think that the findings that resulted because of it are very interesting, and I'm appreciative that someone was willing to put themselves through this. So, what can we conclude? Satie, crazy guy. He was a great inspiration for the humorous, the experimental, and the bizarre, and the composers out there. Or even the not so bizarre composers, and those who just perhaps enjoyed the subtle nature of his work, the non-intrusive nature of his work. Despite the satire, he gained a following, and people who either enjoyed the humor, who saw depth in it and maturity like Debussy did, combination of the two, either of the two. Some people just enjoy it, find it relaxing, and that's completely fine. The Vexations study revealed some fascinating statistics for us about the consciousness of pianists over time. Again, really cool study. I had a lot of fun reading about it. You may have heard about it before. I know that some popular people on YouTube have done videos on it, so you may have seen that. Really cool, though, I have to say. And believe it or not, full Vexations performances are still presented to this day. Some people will just perform it and do it once through. Some people will aim to do it 840 times. Again, the motive can be interpreted a bit differently. It can be interpreted as being just that theme. It can be interpreted as the whole thing. So the lengths differ, but people still do it, which is crazy to me. And with that said, that is the end of my presentation. So thank you for sticking around at the end and watching. I had a lot of fun reading and just learning about Satie. I was very worried going in because I thought of him as the guy who came up with elevator music. I was very worried I was going to be bored. As it turned out, he was a crazy character, and I really enjoyed learning about him. I hope you enjoyed learning about him as well. So with that said, thank you for your time, and thank you for your love of music. Have a great day.